the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, July 1st, 2015. Actor and activist Mike Farrell joins us live in studio in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling on executions by lethal injection. Farrell is the president of Death Penalty Focus and will discuss how far the ruling has set back the movement to end the death penalty. And Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, will also appear in studio to reflect on the gay marriage ruling, the politics of intersectionality, Bree Newsome, and much more. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Christina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Christina.
Hello, Sonali.
A day past its deadline to reach a deal with the International Monetary Fund and other creditors, Greece is now officially in default. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras put forward a proposal this morning for a budgetary overhaul to try to revive discussions on a new bailout plan, but his offer was rejected by EU officials. Now, all eyes are turned toward a referendum in Greece on Sunday that puts the question to voters whether or not they want their government to accept creditors' proposals, which means more bailouts in exchange for more austerity. A no vote most likely means a Greek exit from the European Union. Prominent economists like Joseph Stiglitz have recommended a no vote, saying there's no hope in continued austerity. President Obama said that a Greek default would have little impact on the U.S. economy. Still, many see this moment as a turning point on which the entire future of Europe hinges. Christina, how important do you see the situation in Greece as?
Well, I think it's important for several reasons. I'll focus on one here. It really does bring into the conversation of the problematic presence of supranational organizations like the IMF and even in some cases the World Bank in dictating to nations how to structure their economies. And so research, even though we've seen that research and real world consequences has shown us that not only do austerity measures not work, but also that what economists call structural adjustment programs are dire to a nation's economy recovering. So it allows us to have this conversation about the realities and consequences of global capitalism in the 21st century, where people who do benefit actually consist of this small group of people who are the very same people that are asking Greece, for instance, to comply to measures that will actually worsen their economy.
After more than 50 years, the U.S. and Cuba will be opening embassies in each other's countries. President Obama will make the announcement about the embassy opening today, and Secretary of State John Kerry plans to travel to Havana when the U.S. Embassy is ready to formally open its doors. The plan is to expand an office in Havana called the U.S. Interest Section into a full-fledged embassy. The U.S. recently removed Cuba from its list of state sponsors of terrorism, which was key to restoring full diplomatic ties. The economic embargo against Cuba remains in place, however, and the decision to reverse that lies with the U.S. Congress. U.S.-Cuba ties are likely to become a factor in next year's presidential elections. Obama expects the Cuba détente to be a central part of his foreign policy legacy. Well, Christina, the Cuba rapprochement seems to be moving very rapidly. How important is it for U.S.-Cuba relations to improve?
You know, I like to be cautious. Of course, it's very important that the two countries improve their relations, mostly for Cuban sake. That includes giving Cuban Americans more space to assist their families on the island, expanding travel opportunities between both countries, assisting Cuba's tourist economy, to name a few different factors that would help. But I'm also cautious because history has shown us that American capitalism is very rapid and expansive. So I hope that we don't see Havana turn into another Cancun or another Costa Rica, where many white Americans have decided to colonize the lands of the native people there, which has in many ways made certain parts inaccessible to locals. And so I'm also thinking about the economy of Cuba, and I think we need to, again, learn the lessons from our past.
And finally, the Western Washington chapter of the Girl Scouts made waves when it returned a $100,000 donation this week. The organization received the funds with a major string attached. Quote, "Please guarantee that our gift will not be used to support transgender girls. If you can't, please return the money." So the Girl Scouts returned it and set up their own crowdfunding campaign to make up the loss of what would have been a third of their annual fundraising goal. With the messages, "We welcome transgender girls" and "Girl Scouts is for every girl," the group has so far raised $250,000. The news comes on the heels of a Supreme Court decision to legalize gay marriage and the 46th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which were started by 2 trans women and seen as the opening salvo of the LGBT rights movement. In contrast, the Boy Scouts of America has long had trouble accepting boys who identify as gay or transgender. Christina, is this story an indication of the growing cultural shift in the U.S. over LGBT rights?
I think among many of the other new developments that we've seen recently, we can definitely see the story as an example of the shift to accept and embrace people who identify as LGBTQ. I think it's important for even more nonprofit and for-profit entities to do the same. Now, it would be even better and more indicative of a real cultural shift if we saw more religious institutions, for example, accept and embrace LGBTQ communities. I do want to say, however, that while we're slowly becoming more progressive in terms of sexuality, I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's still some issues that we need to face, and there are some issues even within the LGBT community. So, for instance, recently activists in Chicago staged a blackout pride protest in the Pride Parade, and what it did was really highlighted the kind of marginalization that people of color feel also within LGBTQ communities, and the rates of violence against, for instance, trans people of color are insane. So I think while we need to look at these stories as examples of progress, at the same time, we also need to make sure that we focus on other issues that are going on as well that we need to discuss more.
And we will be continuing that conversation on Blackout Pride and other issues with Patrisse Cullors later in the program. Thank you so much, Christina, as always, for joining us.
Thank you.
Christina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. When the Supreme Court ruled on Friday to legalize marriage in all 50 states, Americans erupted in celebration. More than 26 million people on Facebook used the rainbow flag filter to express their pride in the ruling, and uses of the hashtag #LoveWins flew thick and fast through social media. But in Chicago, a group of mostly African-American activists wearing T-shirts that read #BlackoutPride interrupted the Pride Parade there on Sunday with a die-in. In a statement published online, the group said, "We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and demand the permanent abolition of the racist police state. The queer community must call for an immediate end to racist policies that make trans and queer people of color into the targets of deadly state violence," end of quote. The action highlighted the challenges of intersectional politics reflected in the rumblings from those who say that while it is wonderful for the Supreme Court to legalize marriage, they're waiting for the day when the court will legalize being black in America. My guest is Patrisse Cullors. She is the director of the Truth and Reinvestment Campaign for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. She's also the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement with fellow organizers Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi. She also founded the LA-based organization Dignity and Power Now. She's an artist and an activist and a Fulbright scholar. She was named the 2007 Mario Savio Activist of the Year. She received the Sidney Goldfarb Award and earned a degree in religion and philosophy from UCLA. And she joined us for the first time last December She is now back in studio. I'm so glad to welcome you back to the
Well,
program.
it's good to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, you were saying right before we went on the air how much has happened since the last time that we had you on. And so I hope this is an ongoing conversation that we can have with you here. So first, let's begin with the Supreme Court decision, which came so soon after the nation was mourning the deaths of 9 African Americans in this terrorist attack by the white supremacist Dylann Roof. And in fact, it was on Friday, the same day that Reverend Pinckney was laid to rest in Charleston, that the court ruled on gay marriage. And I'm wondering if the proximity of the tragedy to that celebration has created this conversation, or has sort of prompted this conversation of two movements that seem separate but probably shouldn't be.
Yes, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that the LGBT movement, in large part, has neglected the fight for Black lives. And what you've seen is a significant amount of Black folks on the front lines who are queer, who are trans, that have said the LGBT movement does not speak for us, because mostly it is led by white, upper middle class gay men who have an agenda that's specifically about assimilation. And I think where Black Lives Matter comes in, and I think this really amazing protest that happened in Chicago, as well as protests across the country, many Black Lives Matter chapters shut down their prides across the country. BLM Minneapolis took down their stage, and at the stage they spoke to the need for folks to fight for Black trans women. You saw folks in Black Lives Matter Toronto that took the opportunity to speak about the issues of Black trans women in particular. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has really tried to push a broad understanding of what intersectionality can look like and the practice of it, where we've seen that the mainstream LGBT movement really capitulate to sort of a white mainstream hegemony.
And this is perhaps just a chapter in the discussion that began all the way back, if you go 46 years ago, with the Stonewall riots, which were started by the actions of 2 trans women, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha Johnson, who essentially, created this resistance that got taken up, and then along the way, the fight to essentially assimilate and to be like everyone else may have taken over the movement. And then we have the gay marriage ruling at the Supreme Court. But isn't that marriage ruling something really to celebrate?
It is. It's significant. I don't think any of us in the Black Lives Matter movement isn't talking about its significance. I think what we're trying to say, though, is while folks can get married now, which is a huge deal, we are still witnessing extreme attacks of violence against Black people. And it's this conversation about citizenship, really, right? As we talk about, legalizing and amnesty for folks who are undocumented, there's also this lingering conversation about, are Black people really citizens of this country? Do we actually have full rights? And we don't. And I think that becomes this important conversation, sometimes huge argument. Sometimes it opens up a space for homophobic people, especially in the Black community, to come in and say, well, they got theirs and now we have to get ours. And we're actually saying, no, this isn't one or the other. We have to bring these conversations together.
Right. Especially given that queer Black women have been on the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been such an amazing aspect of this new wave of activism that we've seen. And it seems just fitting that that is the leadership that is needed now, I think, more than ever.
Precisely. And I think it's both queer Black women, but it's also Black trans folk,
women,
that have been at the front lines. And we've really challenged not just our movement, but every single sector of society to honor our leadership and to let us determine our own destinies. And so in the LGBTQ movement, that's the same question, right? If you look at any mainstream LGBT organization, it's mostly ran by white folks. We are not represented in those spaces.
And that's important because when we think about just going back to the question of what you were saying, citizenship, I made a comment on Friday when that ruling came about that now we could stop calling it gay marriage and just start calling it marriage because that goes to the heart of LGBT folks. simply being treated as people,
Yes.
as human beings with a full spectrum of rights. However, as you were pointing out, African Americans in this country have never had that.
Exactly.
Still are waiting for that. Undocumented folks are also struggling for it. So that question of how a court or legal system or government considers you a full citizen with a full set of rights is a big struggle. So for folks who are who have multiple identities, of course we all have multiple identities, but some identities stand out more than others. It's hard to keep these issues in separate boxes. We can't keep them and shouldn't keep them in separate boxes, right?
It's dangerous to keep them in separate boxes when you live in a white supremacist nation, because what happens is white folks in all sectors will always end up getting the upper hand. They will always end up leading the conversation if it's not an intersectional analysis. White people are seen as human beings, whether they're LGBTQ, disabled, children. There is something about whiteness that allows for people to see them as full humans and people to have compassion about and empathy. But when it comes to Black folks in particular, we're not offered that same compassion. We're not offered that same empathy. So it is important that we bring the folks at the margins to the center of this conversation. And we think the LGBTQ mainstream movement has large in part neglected those conversations.
Foreign policy analyst Ajamu Baraka made a really important point that in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo shootings in France earlier this year, all over the world, people held up signs saying "Je suis Charlie," including the Oscar ceremony. Where are the "Je suis" or "We are Charleston" signs? Where is that empathy for people who live right here?
Yes.
And where the death toll was comparable.
Yes. I think, what's really intense about anti-Black racism is that it really, I think we're complicit in it. And I think in large part, people are just so used to Black death and Black brutality. And people are numbed to that reality, and which does not allow for, I think, the same sort of need to fight as urgently, right? It is not, it's so commonplace for Black people to be killed, for Black people to be brutalized, that folks are sort of shrug their shoulders, I think, and, well, that's what happens to Black people, versus this is absolutely unacceptable and we need to fight. We all hands on deck to fight for Black life.
Yeah. Let's turn to a woman over the weekend who became a national hero, Bree Newsome, the African-American activist, musician, filmmaker, scaled the flagpole of the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, to tear down the Confederate flag. What do you make of her action?
Bree Newsome is a local hero. I think that the work that her and her community did, because it was a community effort, I want to make sure that we know that we don't want to Rosa Parks her, right? Because we all know that Rosa Parks, there was a whole strategy behind that. Rosa Parks was trained for that moment. So was Bree. Bree was trained for that moment, and her community was a part of that training. And I think it was one of the most creative, courageous actions we've seen thus far as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And
for our TV audience, you can see the video of her actually taking down the flag, captured in full glory, which also speaks to the way in which social media has been employed to capture and document these actions. Now, she was immediately lionized by people all over the nation, and as you sort of implicated earlier, artists drew these superhero representations of her. And it is important, I think, for us to identify Black women, especially as leaders and heroes of the movement, right? Or can that be a bad thing?
No, I think it's extremely important. I think as long as we are making clear that this movement is leaderful, that this movement is about all of us, and that there are many, many heroes. And as we saw with Ella Baker, as we saw with Fannie Lou Hamer, many women who do not get the shine that they deserved. I mean, Ella Baker was the architect of the civil rights movement. And she was clear about why it needed to be leaderful, why we should not have a charismatic leader that we're following. And I think we are seeing this generation model that in some of the most profound ways.
Incidentally, the Washington Post and other newspapers did these lengthy pieces describing who Bree Newsome was, and she really is perfect. Her educational background,
Right.
her activist background is impeccable. You know, her father was a dean at Howard University. But we can't be demanding this type of perfection from all activists, right? Isn't that a slippery slope?
Of course, and the media is so wants the perfect activist, right?
Especially when it comes to Black folks.
Especially when it comes to Black folks. So she's been idealized in a way that I think she would reject as well. I think this movement has been great at saying respectability politics won't save you. We see that by the shootings in the churches. We see that by now 7 churches that have been burned.
Yes.
You know, it's been going viral on Twitter. Who is burning Black churches, right? And I think we can't allow for the respectability politics to dictate how we have this conversation.
President Obama delivered the eulogy for Reverend Pinckney on Friday, and it was very moving. And one of the things he did say, speaking of the Black church, he said, "The church is and always has been the center of African American life, a place to call our own in a too often hostile world, a sanctuary for so many hardships." And that was certainly true during the civil rights movement, and certainly the older generation of folks still, have that as a very important part of life. But what about younger activists? What about the Black Lives Matter movement? Are people meeting in churches? Do they see the church still as central to the community?
The church is a part of the community, but is not central to how we move or how we develop our analysis. One of my good friends, Heba Farag, who is one of the associate directors for the USC Religion Studies Department, did an article about the Black Lives Matter movement and focused on the ways in which we look at spirituality, and that it's actually really different from our past civil rights movement that was very Christian focused. I think we come from, in a lot of ways, like a new agey, folks who've have sort of like found themselves in a particular way, and sometimes it can be really problematic, but I think it's and the ways that we've reclaimed it, a healing justice narrative, a narrative that actually speaks to why it is absolutely necessary for us to be whole human beings in this work, and a narrative that really calls for diverse spiritual practices to be central to our work. And so you'll see pictures of Black women saging protest, right? Or you'll see images of Black Lives Matter LA showing up to Mayor Garcetti's house, right?
Yes.
And full white garb and doing a full-on ceremony for Ezell Ford. And so we've decided that we're going to take our traditional practices and not hide them. And so I think our movement is very spiritual. She asked me a question, do you feel like you're a faith-based movement? I said, that's interesting. I would never describe it as such, but I do think there's a significant amount of spiritually led practices in this current Black Lives Matter movement.
Obama also delivered during his eulogy a rendition of Amazing Grace, which was quite moving, I have to say.
I definitely cried.
Did you? I mean,
did.
What did you make of that moment? I mean, was he sincere? He has, in many ways, reflected the pain that people are feeling, but then he is the one person who has the power to do more than any of the rest of us do about that pain.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character in our generation, I believe. First Black president. I can't even imagine that surmountable amount of pressure that he's been under. And he's also the leader of the U.S. empire, which, when I did vote for him, I think I was too naive at that moment to really understand, actually Obama is not going to be the revolution. No elected official is going to be the revolution. But what I think he did do very respectfully is hone in on the crisis that Black folks are facing and reflect that pain and suffering that we're facing inside of this country. And as I heard him sing, that song is so powerful. It's a really self-reflective song, right? It felt like he was actually apologizing to Black America.
A wretch like me.
Right. It felt like he was apologizing. But I don't want to then leave him off the hook. He still has, a little over a year and a half to still do right by Black America.
Right. So the conversation around the Confederate flag, and I asked this of Melina Abdullah as well when we had her on the show recently, whether it's the distraction or whether it is an important symbol, and I'm guessing that you might agree it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this country is obsessed with making everything a spectacle. The reality is the Confederate flag is a dangerous symbol. I remember I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. I remember seeing folks with their Confederate flags on their trucks.
Really?
And, oh yeah, there's lots of white supremacist groups in the San Fernando Valley and the Antelope Valley. And I would see them with their Confederate flags, and it was an automatic sense of fear in my body. So it's terrible, and I think we do have to focus on it, but I don't think the conversation is once the flag is down, racism is over.
Right. And of course, then President Obama did actually explicitly call for the flag to come down, which is quite significant. And going back to the flag heroine, Bree Newsome, one of the interesting things that came out of the national attention that she got for her action was that people raised over $100,000 to help pay for legal defense. And this brings up a really important point, that there are many Black Lives Matter activists and related folks who are facing mounting legal fees around the country because they have been arrested for their actions. They've been often overcharged, have faced important and have faced very high legal fees and bail money. How important is it for people to donate to the legal funds of everybody?
It's huge. We live in a country that has the centerpiece is the prison industrial complex, and our constitutional rights have been criminalized. The right to protest has been criminalized. And so I think folks, when you see folks asking for bail funds or jail support monies, please support.
So some of those who have been struggling with that in Southern California, where this program is recorded, are two Black Lives Matter activists. You mentioned the confrontation taking place with the mayor, Eric Garcetti, who has been dubbed the backdoor mayor because he tried to escape from a back door so he could avoid BLM activists, wanting him to do something about Ezell Ford's killing and the killings of other folks. And he's taken almost no action against the LAPD. So recently, two young activists, Evan Bunch and Luz Flores, were arrested and have now been charged. They've been trying to, LAPD and the mayor have been trying to get these just bizarre restrictions against them. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
Yeah, so we did an action called Follow LA Mayor, because that's what organizers do. They follow elected officials until they meet with them. He should know that. That's what you sign up for. And myself and Melina went to one of the first Follow LA Mayors at the Biltmore Hotel, in which we were escorted out by police forcefully. And my arm was in a sling for a couple days after that incident. Wow. And then we followed him to the Raise the Wage hearing, where he, the sign-in, where we held up Black Lives Matter signs and signs that Ezell Ford would have wanted a living wage. And then most recently, Black Lives Matter activists went to an event where they were told it was private. They said they wanted to meet with the mayor, and then literally were arrested immediately. The police say that they got in a scuffle with the police.
Don't they always say that?
Exactly. Our folks say that that's actually not what happened, and they were arrested literally on site. They're saying that Evan Bunch was resisting arrest. I think they're trying to charge him with battery and assault an officer, and then they're trying to charge Luz with lynching to incite a riot because she tried to. We're not clear what she tried to do, right? But that's what they're trying to charge her with.
And the height of irony of charging this young Black woman with lynching.
Exactly.
And let's actually explore that for a second, because the whole history of lynching, which is that's what was done to the Charleston Nine. They were lynched.
Exactly.
And I understand that this legal charge, because I had to look into it, I was so confused.
Yeah.
It comes from if somebody apparently tries to take another arrested person out of police custody Which is what white mobs did
Exactly.
to black men
Exactly.
in police custody historically. Then you're charged with lynching. This is still on the books today?
It's still on the books.
And they're using it in this context?
There was a young woman in Sacramento, I don't know if you remember her, Malia, who was also charged with lynching. And it was huge. She was at a protest. She was young black woman who was queer, leading protests in Sacktown, and was arrested. And they tried to charge her with lynching, and she went through an entire process. Finally, the case was dropped, but it was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous. Lots of folks did articles on her. But yeah, this is a charge that's on the books that our folks, Black Lives Matter members, black people, are being charged with lynching.
And this is a way, of course, to derail movements.
Oh, of course.
Even if they know at the end of a long legal fight charges will be dropped, they've engaged you in a long legal fight. They've distracted you from the work that you're doing. They've sucked all the money out of you and perhaps some of the soul out of you. And it leaves you with less time and energy to actually organize.
Yes, and I mean, I want to be clear, no resident should have to do this much to meet with their mayor.
Right.
People should not have to get arrested. People should not have to follow their elected officials. Elected officials should say, you know what, this is what I'm your servant, I'm your public servant. I will have this meeting with you. And he essentially had refused. We just got word that he will meet with us. And we said we will, put our qualms aside to have the meeting, but it shouldn't have taken this much for us to meet with him.
Right. Now, there's also the Pasadena-based activist Jasmine Richards. She appeared on Uprising with you last December. She was in studio. She too has been charged with terrorism.
Terrorist threats.
Making terrorist threats for her work on Black Lives Matter. Again, the irony of this, what has happened with her case. And again, all of these instances, and we're just talking about the ones in Southern California, nationwide, I mean, Ferguson, Baltimore, Oakland, there are people who are fighting these charges or trying to fight them, don't have the money and the legal representation. So what's the situation with Jasmine?
Jasmine's still fighting her charges. They have not dropped them. We were just in court with her last week. And it's a process. These are exactly like you said, this long legal process. So,
and this is a very brave young woman who is doing incredible work in her community.
Yeah, she's the local chapter lead in Pasadena. Just went to one of their Pasadena meetings where at least 40 to 50 Black Pasadena folks were there talking about what Black Lives Matter looks like for them.
Now, the one last question on the issue of Bree Newsome and the Confederate flag. That whole discussion around the Confederate flag has, as a symbol of white supremacy, has raised the question of how people can best express their ire symbolically. Some people talk about simply burning those flags down.
There's been lots of
and
burnings.
flag burning is a constitutionally protected form of speech. What do you make of Confederate flag burning?
I think that's powerful. I also think it's important that we talk about the American flag, which is a symbol of lots of hate as well. And I've really been appreciative of Black Lives Matter members who have said, yes, the Confederate flag is a terrible symbol of a particular historical moment, but the American flag is also a terrible symbol of our particular moment. I mean, this American flag is being waved while Black people are dying every 28 hours by a vigilante security guard or police officer. So I think I appreciate the Confederate flag burning. I think it's a powerful symbol, and it's really amazing to be alive watching people burn it down. And I want to question, too, like, where are we saying then that the American flag is a symbol that we are standing by? It's not a symbol I stand by.
As we head toward the 4th of July. Now, there have also been unknown, I understand, activists around the country who've been spray painting #Black Lives Matter on Confederate statues all over the U.S., especially on college campuses. Any idea who's behind that and how important a political expression is that?
No idea. I love it, though. I love what folks are doing, their imagination. I think it's a huge political expression. I just saw an image of Black Lives Matter spray painted on Columbus statue with blood all over it. And What a powerful symbol of solidarity.
And so it could be coming from anyone. We're not sure yet. This is a really, really interesting moment. So I want to turn to the fact that what you mentioned earlier, which is that churches have been burning around the country. Seventh church burning this week. This was in South Carolina, incidentally, also an AME church. And what does it signal about the time that we're living in today? Because on the one hand, people are, people are spray painting solidarity signs on Confederate symbols, but then if these church burnings are indeed deliberate, which how could they not be? It's just too much of a coincidence. The backlash from people who are willing to kill is frightening, is so, so frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that? How do we make sense of the time we're living in today? This is not 1950s America. It shouldn't be. We should have moved past that, but we never did.
Yeah, I don't think we make sense of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, right? Senseless murder, burning down people's sacred symbols. But what we do is sort of get grounded in the reality that racism is still alive and well, and that we have a duty to fight for our freedom, and we have every sort of responsibility to be clear about what that fight looks like. And I think, what's been important for me in these conversations, racism does not go away in 50 years. It can't. That takes a significant amount of work. You can't just desegregate a school and think that people are going to stop hating Black people. I think we've come a long ways, but folks are still, there's still deep-seated racism in communities, and we have neo-Nazi groups, we have KKK groups, and they exist. And if you've ever looked on their websites, if you've ever watched their videos, they completely and wholeheartedly believe that this is their country, and they will fight by any means necessary to continue that. And if Black people get in their way, they will sacrifice themselves for it.
Okay, so on that, some on the left are raising the possibility of African Americans arming themselves in self-defense. And this was, of course, the approach of the Black Panther Party. Last year, there was an interesting book published by Akinyele Omowale Omoja entitled "We Will Shoot Back: Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement," which people have now been discussing as an idea whose time has come. I'm a little frightened by this idea because, I really do feel strongly about gun violence not being a solution. But I can sympathize with the siege that people are feeling under. How do you reflect on this?
Every human being has the right to defend themselves. And I think what we've done a really interesting thing to Black Americans, which has been folks have told us to be courageous fighters as well as docile human beings. I think every human being has the right to defend themselves. Do I think they should defend themselves by the gun? That's all, we have our own rights, so folks can make those decisions. But really, at the end of the day, our communities have to think about self-defense. I think it's every animal defends itself. And so to call for us to not defend ourselves or to sort of minimize that as a solution, I think is wrong. And I think we've seen some of the most powerful actions that have been nonviolent across the country that have also been a part of defending ourselves. So what I think is so powerful about the Panther Party, what was so powerful about the Panther Party was sort of coming out courageously saying, it was this, it was an anti-hegemonic stance to say we are going to defend ourselves from people who kill us every single day. Will that fly in the same ways during this generation? I'm not quite sure. We live in a different state. We live in a different place. I'm not sure if that's like the best tactic for us.
Right.
It was a great tactic for the Panther Party. But I do think it's all about strategy, what's best for us as Black people. I think we should decide that. But I think it's an important conversation to be having.
Yeah. I mean, it would be really interesting to see how the NRA feels about this because, of course, their approach is if there's school violence in a school, arm the teachers.
Exactly.
So
they said the same thing about the churches.
They did.
They
right. Exactly.
And
that the Reverend Pinckney shouldn't have.
Yeah, if he had a gun.
If he hadn't vetoed a bill that would have allowed open carry in churches, he and his fellow church members would be alive today. Of course, which is completely arguable. I mean, maybe he would have been alive or maybe not.
Exactly.
Maybe he wouldn't have wanted to carry a gun because
Exactly.
that's his right to not want to carry a gun.
Exactly.
Well, finally, Patrisse, I want to ask you about solidarity politics, and this is something we've also tackled on this show quite a bit, and I think that's really crucial. We had had a conversation with a white activist to talk about the issue of white allies. I wrote a column on Truth Dig last week about confronting anti-Black racism in the Asian community and how that's really important. And I think a lot of non-Black Americans, particularly people of color, brown folks and others, want to desperately not stand for this anymore, and many of us haven't been present enough. What do you hope to see? I'm not going to ask you for instruction, but what do you hope to see outside the Black community?
I always have interesting ideas, I think. One thing I've called on, and this was last night, especially after the 7th church burning, I said, white allies, I need you to take more risks. And I said, some of you really need to contemplate infiltrating white supremacist groups. And that is a tactic that many anti-racist white people have done. They've infiltrated white supremacist groups as a way to be a detail, as a way to tell other members. Imagine if there was an anti-racist white ally that was warning us before Dylan Roof showed up, right? Or warning us before a church was burnt. So I think there needs to be greater risk, because the reality is just living as Black is a great risk, and then being in the movement is even a greater risk. So that is a call that I'm really serious about. I think the other opportunity for folks is to really figure out new and creative actions. I don't know if you've been following the Never 21 folks, the folks in New York, mostly white, that have done 2 actions. One of them was at Forever 21, where they in Times Square, where they put Black Lives Matter T-shirts
on the mannequins.
And they just the other day they did this amazing protest that took only 15 minutes long in an upscale restaurant, where they changed the menu to the names of children, Black children who have died, and they positioned themselves as waiters, and so they came to the table with these menus that have Black children's names who have died.
Wow.
I thought that was really powerful, creative. It's not putting them in the spotlight. They've been really good about trying not to take up too much space, but also it's them challenging other white affluent people.
Well, on that note and those creative ideas, I want to thank you so much, Patrisse, and I hope to continue this conversation with you in the future as this movement continues. And thank you for all the work that you and other activists have been doing.
Of course, thank you so much.
My guest, Patrisse Cullors, is director of the Truth and Reinvestment Campaign for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. She's a co-founder of Black Lives Matter with fellow organizers Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi. She's also founded the LA-based organization Dignity and Power Now. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. The United States Supreme Court this week dealt a serious blow to the opponents of the death penalty. In a 5-4 ruling on Glossop v. Gross, justices determined that the lethal injection drug midazolam can be continued to be used in conducting executions. And if it is not available, another drug will have to be substituted. Just over a year ago, the state of Oklahoma executed death row inmate Clayton Lockett in a horrific 45-minute-long procedure with the use of a three-drug cocktail that included midazolam. Death penalty opponents argued that the ordeal amounted to cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the U.S. Constitution. But Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito was not having it. Writing the opinion for the majority, Justice Alito said, quote, "Because it is settled that capital punishment is constitutional, it necessarily follows that there must be a constitutional means of carrying it out. And because some risk of pain is inherent in any method of execution, we have held that the Constitution does not require the avoidance of all risk of pain. After all, while most humans wish to die a painless death, many do not have that good fortune." End of quote. That was Justice Samuel Alito writing that. The ruling potentially sets back decades of anti-death penalty activism. Joining me now on the phone to discuss how deep the damage runs is Mike Farrell, well-known actor who rose to stardom in the classic TV series MASH as Captain B.J. Honeycutt. He's a longtime political activist who worked in Central America in the 1980s, aiding refugees. He was for many years the co-chair of the California chapter of Human Rights Watch. He's also the president of the California-based Death Penalty Focus. His autobiography is titled Just Call Me Mike, A Journey to Actor and Activist. Welcome to the program, Mike.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. We were looking forward to having you in studio, but we will make do on the phone.
I am so sorry about the confusion. I suddenly had my grandson with me last night, and I had to prepare him for school.
No problem. We understand you're very, very busy. Well, how do you understand this ruling? This is a very, very important ruling. The Justice Alito basically said that since we have the death penalty, we must carry it out by any means necessary, regardless of the level of pain. I mean, that's incredible.
He almost said that, and I think Justice Sotomayor countered it quite thoroughly by saying that we're talking about drawing and quartering people, or are we talking about burning them alive? Justice Alito has made his position very clear, even from the initial dialogue between the attorneys before the decision was made, when he talked about a guerrilla war that is being fought, in his view, against the death penalty in this country. Well, of course, it's not a guerrilla war in the sense that we are American citizens. We are talking about taking advantage of our rights to speak freely and taking an issue on a social issue and a political issue. But his view is, I think, quite extraordinarily ugly in that if it is constitutional, then it requires that there be some constitutionally acceptable means to snuff out the lives of individuals who have been sentenced to death. I think the most important piece of this decision is the dissent. Certainly the dissent by Justice Breyer, joined by Justice Ginsburg, which calls into question the whole concept of the constitutionality of the death penalty, and I think that will be it is now ripe for discussion, and I think that it will be challenged significantly in the near future. But yes, what the decision does is lay bare the kind of ugly brutality of the death system and the way in which we have sort of are expected to look the other way when we commit a homicidal act that is both inhumane and even inhumane by the constitutional standards that these justices continue to claim that they're trying to hold dear.
Right. I mean, so on the issue of the fact that Justice Breyer raised the entire constitutionality of the act itself, the legal tactic that led to this particular case was based on the method of execution amounting to cruel and unusual punishment. And in retrospect, would it have been a better approach to simply question the constitutionality of the entire death penalty instead?
Well, that is, of course, under consideration in legal circles, and they're always looking for a case, excuse me, where it can go to that question. But because it has been attacked incrementally for the past number of years, ever since it was reinstated in '76, with some success, narrowing the application to avoid the use of the death penalty against children, those who committed their crimes, if they did, under the age of 18, and then against the mentally damaged, and now that even has been expanded to the mental disability concept. So there have been forays against the death penalty through the legal community for decades now, and this one came up because lethal injection was the most generally acceptable method since the gas chamber was deemed inappropriate. And it's taken some time, I think, for people to understand that the lethal injection is still murder. It's still killing a human being, and it is not, in fact, harmless or painless. And the drugs that were used to most, I think, appropriately, or not appropriately, but most effectively mask the pain have now become unavailable
because the drug makers don't want their drugs to be used in this way.
Exactly.
Now, this is really interesting because even midazolam, the makers of the of that drug Acorn line, said it, quote, strongly objects to the use of its products in capital punishment. They're asking the state of Oklahoma to return the drug supply that it had bought for a full refund. But even if states don't actually issue refunds, eventually they will run out and need to get more. And at that point, what will happen? Where do they plan to get them? Because even though this decision affirms the use of lethal injection to kill people, the supply of these drugs is not ensured.
Yes, that's quite correct. And of course, there are other drugs that are being used in other states now for what they're calling a single drug rather than a triple drug execution. So they will, they will continue to try to find ways in which to, they being, the Texans and the Oklahomans and the Floridians and the Missourians and those Ohioans and those who continue to want to use it. Now, and we have a threat here in California as a result of a lawsuit. The governor has indicated that as a result of the Glossip, or after the Glossip decision, he has 120 days to determine a single drug execution scenario, and that is something that is going to concern us greatly. It will be challenged on every level. It will not be immediately put into effect, but nonetheless, it is a real challenge, I think, to those of us who want to see an end to the use of the death penalty here in California and across the country.
Right. California hasn't executed anyone for at least 10 years, but Governor Jerry Brown entered into this settlement with victims' families who filed a lawsuit, and that settlement was based on the outcome of the Supreme Court ruling. And so we will start to see some legal battles and possibly a readying of executions again in Oklahoma, where the three death row inmates who challenged the lethal injection are based. Oklahoma is already moving to set execution dates for Richard Glossip, Marion Grant, and Benjamin Robert Cole. And for those three men in particular, is this the end of the road?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the question.
For the three men in Oklahoma for whom the state is setting execution dates because the Supreme Court has ruled now, is that the end of their process of appeal?
Well, I'm sure there will be further challenges on the parts of the attorneys defending them. Whether or not those challenges will have effect because of the Glossip ruling remains in question. But Oklahoma appears to be intending to go forward with the with the midazolam, as you suggested, and that has been demonstrated to be a problematic drug in terms of inducing the deep coma-like sleep in which they will not feel any pain. However, justice, I hesitate to use the term justice in terms of Mr. Alito, but the Alito decision argues, as you suggested, that a certain amount of pain may be constitutionally tolerable. So it really, I think it reduces us as a nation to a degree that is, I think, heretofore unseen.
Now, there's also the important issue, since the court did sort of address, at least in the writings of the opinions on the death penalty as a whole, there's the issue of the fact that we have and do execute innocent people. The case of Glenn Ford is illustrative of that. He was the longest serving death row inmate, released last year after serving 30 years in Louisiana for a crime he didn't commit. And sadly, Mr. Ford died this week after just 1 year of freedom. I mean, he lost 30 years of his life. He got something like $20 compensation from the state. How many Glenn Fords are there still on death row? We'll never know. But there's just that doubt should be enough cause for this practice to be put on hold indefinitely, right?
No, absolutely. And in fact, there was a release in Ohio late last year of Wiley Bridgman and his brother Kwame Ajamu, who were there for 33 years. So we see this and this growing sense of the reality of the inappropriateness of the death penalty and the wrong-headedness of the prosecutorial forces, and it's become, I think, so obvious to the people in the country that we're now losing, or we are gaining, but the country is losing its willingness to support the continued use of the death penalty. And we in the Death Penalty Focus are looking at whether or not it's feasible to put an initiative on the ballot next year to ask the people of California to simply say this must be brought to an end.
Right, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because even though the Supreme Court said it was constitutional to kill people by drugs, it didn't say that states have to have the death penalty and have to put people on death row and kill them. There are a growing number of states that have simply abolished the death penalty. Nebraska just did it this year. And so does the Supreme Court ruling, how does it sort of impact the movement going forward? Are people simply going to turn the fight against the death penalty into the state-by-state movement that has already been going on to an extent, and that the bizarre nature of the conversation around the death penalty has also led to Utah, for example, declaring that it will simply kill people by firing squad as a backup plan. So we've really come to a very strange state of affairs.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's coming to the point where we are becoming the brutality of the system has become so obvious as to be discomforting to so many people. But of course, it's so sorry, caught catching my throat. It's always been a state issue primarily, although there is a federal death system. And the state organizations will continue to work, either in our case, we work across the nation, but we also focus in California very much. And we will continue to do the work. There is a national effort as well, the Eighth Amendment Project, which is intending to take it to the Supreme Court and convince enough justices that it simply will not work under the constraints written in the Eighth Amendment, which is cruel and unusual. But I think the state actions have to continue, and the Nebraska effort was an extraordinary, I think, success in that it's what's so-called red state, and the legislature that finally came around on the subject is primarily Republican, so it even puts to the lie to the notion that it's a liberal, conservative, or Republican, Democrat, or whatever you want to call it issue. It's really a humanitarian issue, and people need to understand it from that perspective.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for everything that you do.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Mike Farrell is of course, well-known actor, also longtime activist, and the president of Death Penalty Focus based in California. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor and audio engineer with help from Federico Garcia. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.